want to take a moment to thank our grantor who made this event possible. We received a grant from the Indiana Humanities in cooperation with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we're super grateful for their support and generosity in making this 4-part series possible. We are going to jump right in with our first speaker, who is Matt Gaudin, the clinic's Director of Tax and Economic Justice, and he's going to lead us through the discussion on Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which some of you have read, some of you may not have gotten a chance to read. It's very meaty, I know. But again, if you haven't read it, feel free to still engage in the conversation that Matt will lead. And then the second half of the event will be led by Lena Hackett, who is the Marion County Reentry Coalition Coordinator from Community Solutions, Inc. And she's going to share her perspective, her expert perspective on reentry justice issues. And we can, like I said, open the floor to discussion and questions at any point throughout the evening, but we'll save a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, most likely as well. So with no further ado, we're going to pass it off to Matt.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here, everybody. I'm really excited about this because if you've read the book, you know that probably the first third of the book maybe is all about history and the history of racial discrimination in the United States. And I love history. And so that's what I've chosen to focus my talk on. And I want this to be interactive. I know for those that read the book or heard about the book, it's a controversial book for sure. It has a lot of things in there that there can be definitely disagreements on. I don't agree with everything in the book, but I want this to be a free-flowing conversation. And so disagreement is good. Healthy conversation and debate is good. We have the privilege to be able to do things like that in the country. So I want to encourage that. So we're going to jump right in, and feel free to make comments in the chat box, or at the end, the last 10 or 15 minutes, we'll have a discussion. But I'm going to focus on, like I said, I'm passionate about history. So we're going to focus a lot on that. But before we get to that, I want to talk about Indiana's expungement law. So this is really hard to see on here, but I'll explain it. So Indiana, around 2013 or so, passed an expungement law. And what I mean by expungement is expunging criminal records. They call it an expungement law. Really, a better word, I think, is sealing criminal records, sealing it to the public. And Indiana has probably one of the most, I guess you'd call it maybe pro-ex-offender or pro-expungement laws in the country. It's at the forefront of it. A lot of states have looked towards Indiana's expungement law as a model for theirs. And the reason being is because the Indiana General Assembly realized that when you have a criminal record, it is really tough to get a job. It is really tough. Unemployment rates skyrocket for people that have committed a crime and have a conviction on the record. And so the purpose of the law really, and the reason I think it passed the General Assembly, is to get people back to work. And that's exactly what it does. So our office does a lot of expungements. And so because of COVID, like everything, there's been some pauses in it and trying to do things more virtually. So, but our last full year pre-COVID, where we had a physical expungement help desk at the city county building, we helped about 1,300 people get expungements. And so not everyone there was getting expungement to be able to get a job. Some people wanted to just get the expungement to get the criminal conviction off their back. It was for emotional reasons, psychological reasons, which is fine and great. But the vast majority want to get an expungement to get a job. And so we consider our work there helping people get back in the workforce and generally re-entering into society. And so if we have time, I'll come back and talk a little bit about Indiana's expungement law specifics, because I think it's really interesting. But I want to get through some other things. So the title of the book, The New Jim Crow, right? When I read this, I've heard of the Jim Crow. I'm sure all of you have learned about it in history class, but what does this even mean? What does Jim Crow mean? And this is something I learned. So there's this guy here. His name was Thomas Daddy Rice. He was a minstrel performer. So he was in the 1800s. These guys would go around and do shows, kind of like maybe similar to like a variety show. And he had this character that he invented called Jim Crow. About 1828 is when it came out. And characteristically from that time period, he did blackface and did these false and bad characteristics, really racist connotations, pejorative expressions of Black people, and acted lazy or untrustworthy or dumb or really prejudicial, discriminatory accent. And so that's where it came from. And so Jim Crow, he's a very famous performer. He would be, you know, if it was today, this would be a guy that would famous actor. And so he had this character, Jim Crow, and that's where it kind of came from. And so we all know the history of slavery in the United States. And then here comes the Civil War, slavery gets abolished, and Reconstruction. And this is where the author really focuses on in the history of Reconstruction. After Reconstruction, here is a picture here of voting. There were a ton of rights given to African Americans, freed slaves in Reconstruction, most notably voting. And for the first time in United States history, there were a significant amount of African American politicians elected to Congress, African American senators, African American congressmen, and on the federal level, and then on the state level. And so this is really a time where African Americans came into a lot of their rights, and civil rights were expanded. But we got this guy came on the scene, Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson was president after Abraham Lincoln. He was Lincoln's vice president. Lincoln put him as the vice president because Johnson was a senator from Kentucky, a southern state, in a state that seceded, but Johnson did not secede with Tennessee. I think I might have said Kentucky. It was Tennessee. He didn't secede with Tennessee. He stayed with the Union. And so Lincoln wanted to reward his loyalty and give him a seat on the national ticket, and also as a way to get more border state voters. But frankly, Johnson was a racist. And I visited his house in Tennessee. It's in Greenville, Tennessee, and they'll kind of tell you that too. Definitely a racist. And he did not support African-American civil rights. And so what happened is these bills were passed. They're called the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment were passed. 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. 14th Amendment, probably the most famous amendment here, talks about equal protection under the law, essentially making African-American citizens, because before that, based on a Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott, they weren't considered citizens. And then the 14th, that should say 15th right there, the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Well, those were passed and Blacks had the right to vote, but because of the whites in the South, with intimidation, violence, they stopped many of the Blacks from voting and from exercising their civil rights. And Johnson didn't do anything about it. He wanted federal troops out of the South as fast as possible. And so Reconstruction didn't really work. But after Johnson came Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant, famous Civil War general, came into the presidency after Johnson, and Grant really stepped it up. He sent federal troops into the South. He put down the KKK that was rising at that time, all kinds of things. And so Blacks enjoyed really a season of prosperity in his time period and of full civil rights, voting all kinds of things. But he's not president forever. And election of 1876 happens, and there's a dispute. Neither candidate, the Republican or the Democrat, wins the electoral vote. So they made a compromise. They couldn't decide who was going to win. So a commission got together and decided, okay, we're going to let the Republican Hayes be president, but Republicans, you need to bring all of the federal troops out of the South. We get them all out. Reconstruction's over. Let us do our own thing. And well, what happened was absolute devastation to African Americans. And she talks about this, Michelle Alexander, in her book. And it was horror. It was absolutely horrible for them. There are a few bright spots in Reconstruction. Benjamin Harrison from Indiana, you can go visit his house on Delaware Street. Kind of a forgotten president. Really, the only reason maybe us around here know him is just because he's from Indiana. His house is on Delaware. He's buried in Crown Hill Cemetery. But Benjamin Harrison was a big proponent of civil rights. And so he tried to get civil rights bills passed in Congress to extend the civil rights of African Americans. Didn't really work. He fought for civil rights. Here's a quote of his, and when he addressed Congress, and I think it's really amazing that someone at this time was saying things like this, and so I'm going to read it all. The colored people did not intrude themselves upon us. They were brought here in chains and held in communities where they are now, chiefly bound by a cruel slave code. When and under what conditions is the Black man to have a free ballot? When is he in fact to have those civil rights which have so long been in law? When is it that quality of influence which our former government was intended to secure to the electors be restored? In many parts of our country where the colored population is large, the people of that race are by various devices deprived of any effective exercise of their political rights and of many of their civil rights. The wrong does not extend itself upon those whose votes are suppressed. The wrong does not. Every constituency in the Union is wronged. And so he tried to get these bills passed, but as we know in Congress, you got to have the votes to do it. Votes in both the House and the Senate, and did not happen. Here's a picture. It's really hard to see, but I love it. This is when Benjamin Harrison got nominated. This is his house. They added the porch later, and this picture, the original, is at the house. You can't really see him, but here's him. He's in back by the door, and this is people in Indianapolis gathering to celebrate after he got the Republican nomination. And scattered throughout here are African Americans. There's a little African American boy right here. There's a man right here, and so they're throughout here. And I just love this image of both whites and blacks at this time coming together and supporting him. But as I said, things went bad. Between 1890 and 1910, 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, starting with Mississippi, passed new constitutions or amendments that effectively disenfranchised most blacks. Right? We know that there was a constitutional amendment that gave African Americans the right to vote, but in a lot of states, they put these laws in, basically called poll taxes, made people pay to vote, or literacy test, and use the literacy test to deprive people of the vote. Here's some pictures of Jim Crow that I found. We've seen things like this before, just horrible discrimination. Let's talk about Indiana. Indiana did not have a lot of discriminatory laws. The Indiana, in the South and the Southern states, they did have a lot of discriminatory laws on the books that I found that said that, where businesses had to be segregated, rail cars had to be segregated, all that. Indiana didn't really have that. The main laws Indiana had on the books that discriminated against blacks were in education. And so you can see here kind of just how the laws were going. Eventually in 1949, Indiana got rid of segregation. So a couple of years there before Brown v. Board of Education. But here's a picture of a African-American school. I'm from Shelbyville, Indiana, and this is the Booker T. Washington School that was in Shelbyville. And my grandparents are deceased now, but I do remember them talking about how the black kids in town had to go to this school as they went to the white school. So most of Indiana's laws were more custom and cultural. So there was discrimination in movie theaters, on some, not all. Discrimination in restaurants and businesses, but it wasn't by law, it was just by custom. So for example, I was talking about Shelbyville, where I'm from. They had a movie theater there, still do. They had the balcony. The balcony was reserved for African Americans. Here are some images. Indiana was a hotbed of the KKK. Here we got Hartford City. Here we got Newcastle, Kokomo, Sullivan, Anderson, I think. Yeah, Anderson. These are the Klan rolls they recently found in Hamilton County. We got Muncie here. Here's a map. Again, it's hard to see. The dark shaded counties are where more than 24% of the white males were on the KKK rolls. I said it was more by custom. It was. There was a famous amusement park in Indianapolis called Riverside Amusement Park, where Riverside Park is now. And it was whites only, except on certain days where they would allow Black people to come in, as you can see. There it says for the 31st. Here's a sign that was outside Riverside where it talks about patronage, whites only. This is a protest that was happening in the 60s. They're protesting outside of the amusement park there. They also had in Indianapolis segregated swimming pools. There is only one swimming pool for African Americans, and here it is. The rest were for whites only. Here's another march in Indianapolis in '64. Don't have time to watch it now, but you can go back and I guess it'd be kind of hard to put that in your browser. But if you just go to YouTube and put in civil rights history, civil rights movement history in Indiana, I think it was the CBS Channel 4 did a special on it last year, which does a really good job of talking about some of the civil rights. As we move along, eventually civil rights movement gets passed. One thing I always like to talk about the civil rights movement is the Civil Rights Act of '64 is where it was maybe one of the last times in recent history where the parties really came together and passed something. You had people on all sides of the aisle. You had liberal Democrats, you had conservative Republicans come together to pass this awesome Civil Rights Act. Here are just some of the unsung heroes of that we don't really talk about. That anytime I love talking about the '64 Civil Rights Act and how it came about. And here's those people we don't really talk about a lot. This is Hubert Humphrey. He was later vice president, liberal Democrat. Then you have Mike Mansfield, who was a Senate leader for the Democrats. He was a moderate Democrat. Next, you have Everett Dirksen. He was a conservative Republican from Illinois. And Thomas Kuchel, a moderate Republican from California. And all these sides came together to pass this monument Civil Rights Act. These four are the leaders that got it done. At that time in Indiana, the Indiana senators were Vance Hartke and Birch Bayh, the father of Evan Bayh. And so things got done. But as Michelle talks about, Michelle Alexander, the author, there's been progress. Got the Civil Rights Act passed, got in '68, I think it was, the Housing Rights Act passed. But her argument is that we've had all this good, but what's really happened is we don't have Jim Crow with discrimination on public accommodations or in hotels or in restaurants or on buses or planes or anything like that. But now there's a new Jim Crow that's come into place. And this new Jim Crow is mass incarceration, the prison system. And because of this, we have just changed the name, changed how the discrimination happens. Yes, we had slavery. We got rid of slavery, and then Jim Crow comes into effect to discriminate against African Americans, especially African American men. We got rid of that, but now we have mass incarceration. And so now in the last 10, 15 minutes, I want to hear your guys' opinions on the book. And so I can talk more if I need to, if there's no participation, but I would love to hear from you. And so I want to take maybe 10 minutes I have a bunch of discussion questions we can talk about, like to hear your opinions. And then I want to end it with a little critique of the book that I found, where not everyone in academia agrees with either her presuppositions, her views on this, how she comes into this, or what her remedies are, what she thinks the problem is. And so we'll talk about that the last couple minutes. Let's skip that one. Okay, so just in your guys' opinion, what effect, if any, do you think this history has on present day America? What effect does antebellum slavery have on current contemporary American or contemporary African Americans? Or what is the civil rights movement, pre-civil rights movement, Jim Crow still has? What effect do these things still have on the United States and Americans? Anybody want it? And then if you do want to talk, just make sure you unmute yourself. It's there on the left-hand side.
Sorry that my video isn't working, Matt,
Okay,
but I think that you still see a lot of it. The old Jim Crow in the South still. I have family that lives in Mississippi, and still very much there's a lot of existing segregation down there still, and I think that that's still very prevalent. I think you can see it in some of these new voting laws that are being passed that are discriminatory against people of color. So I definitely think it's not, I mean, I think the old Jim Crow still exists, especially in the South, at least in my personal reflection of some of my family members.
Sure.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to share? I'll share a quick story. Maybe 2018, had a client who came in for estate planning purposes, and I think she was in her 80s, thereabouts, African American, and was a successful nurse, and so she was a nurse for her career. And she just told me this story that was absolutely heartbreaking. And it kind of just gives you an idea of Indianapolis and the segregation, because like I said, Indianapolis and Indiana didn't have a lot of the segregation laws on the books, but it was just still by custom. And they would, she got her job as a nurse, started making money, and wanted to buy a house. And she had driven by this house many, many times on, it was on Capitol north of 38th Street. I forget, around like the 40 and block or something like that. Anyways, north of 38th Street. She had driven by it, and it was for sale. She went to the realtor, asked if she could she could afford it, and asked if you try to buy it. Realtor said, no, you can't buy it. You know, we're not going to allow African Americans to buy houses north of 38th Street. And so she didn't get it. And that was the kind of discrimination around here. She ended up buying a house on Capitol, just south of 38th Street, and still lives at that house. And what was heartbreaking is she says that sometimes she still just drives by that house that she could have bought, and still sees it and thinks about how her life would be different with that house, and how still after, I think she was trying to buy it in the 50s, and still after all this, it still gets to her. I don't need to share my PowerPoint again. I just want to see you guys. And so the next question I want to ask is, the main premise of the book is that mass incarceration in the United States is now the new Jim Crow. It's the new form of the discrimination. Do you guys agree with that? Disagree with that? Sort of agree with it? Sort of disagree with it? What are your guys' thoughts on it? I know it really hit me first because I never thought about it like that before I read the book. So what are your guys' thoughts?
It was really eye-opening for me, and a lot of information was very new. For me, it really made sense, like at least maybe 80–90%. So in the beginning, Matt, you said you don't agree with some of it, and I would love to like hear what you think. For me, it was very eye-opening, and yeah, and I do want to learn more, and really thank you for this book.
Yeah, it's very eye-opening.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have a comment?
Yes. Am I?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I definitely see that that the mass incarceration has caused a disparity that is untenable. However, I have a hard time thinking, okay, people sat down and planned this and everything's about race. And that's what really rubbed me the wrong way in this book. And that I don't really think that she comes up with any viable solutions. It's just like she's throwing bombs and, you know, trying to get get people to react. And that's what
Yeah.
really bothers me. I know there's a problem. I know we have racial disparity, and it's inexcusable. But what caused the problem, her assessment of that, I don't agree with.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else want to comment? Rachel, you were going to say something, right?
Yeah, just sorry.
Yeah, you're
You know
right.
how I am. I'm a super participator. I can't help it.
All right.
So in college, I had the fortune to take a class called Inside Out Prison Exchange.
Yeah.
And I spent a semester learning alongside 7 prisoners inside the Lebanon medium security jail in Lebanon, Ohio. And for me, that was a really eye-opening experience to how many of those, every single person save one in my class was there because of drugs.
Yeah.
Crack. And it wasn't cocaine, it wasn't marijuana, it was crack. And now that wasn't necessarily the crime, like maybe they had committed a robbery, but it was all tied back to drugs. And so for me, I felt like I saw that a lot of how many people in there were people of color, and that every person was in there because of crack. And then going into kind of the reentry a little bit of it, they were complaining that they weren't learning life skills either. They were saying, like, you're not teaching us anything. So what am I going to do when I get out? Teach me to be a plumber, teach me to be an electrician. That was a place where they made license plates. That was one of the things that they did at that prison. But I do think that, you know, I'm lucky to have had that experience and to have kind of like literally like an insider's perspective, because I was able to do that. But I do think I see a lot of the disparity, like the mass incarceration based on kind of the war on drugs, I think has been really detrimental to the African-American community. Now, I don't necessarily think somebody sat down and was like, hey, I want to imprison all the Black people in the world. But we talk in the law, we talk about disparate impact versus disparate intention. And this was disparate impact.
Definitely right. Yeah. And thanks, Judy, for sharing that. I think if you guys can see the comment about Judy's comment. So there is a, somewhere in the book, in the early part, there's a statistic, I don't know off the top of my head, there's a sentence in there that talks about how drug use among whites and Blacks are pretty similar percentage wise, but more Blacks are arrested for drug use than whites, even though the use of the drugs is pretty similar.
One thing I also noticed, the gang-related activity that kind of is connected to the drugs. You know, with Rachel sharing her experience at a detention center. I remember when I was in college, going on a field trip to the juvenile detention center. That's on 25th and Keystone. And overwhelmingly, the inmates were African Americans and also males. And I want to kind of highlight that because, you know, most of the folks that are incarcerated are the African American males, but I don't know too much about the African American females, you know, that are incarcerated. But anyway, the rate of recidivism was sky high. And what broke my head was they had built this, at the time, state-of-the-art you know, facility, and they had a library, but it was just a revolving door, you know. And the time, and we were advised that some of those folks in there had killed someone. And so, you know, you're kind of thinking, you know, to yourself, all right, that's more than what I wanted to know. But, you know, it was a really unforgettable experience. And when things quiet down for me, I really would like to, you know, delve into this book, but I'm really glad that, you know, I'm hearing these ideas and points.
Thanks for sharing, Michelle, because so I'll share just my comments on it, and I'm by no means an expert on this. I mean, I understand Indiana expungement law, but this is not Indiana expungement law. So I'm learning this along with all of you. And where I struggle with the book is all of that makes sense. And this is kind of getting to what you were saying, Rachel, about the impact. It all makes sense. I think statistics back it up that Blacks are discriminated against based on, like the whole crack cocaine debate, and they're going to get more likely to get arrested, more likely to get pulled over by the police officer and all that. But when you talk about the old Jim Crow, especially in the South, was a whole systematic way of the law getting involved and with the explicit intention of discriminating against Blacks. And I don't know, I think that the impact, like you were saying, Rachel, is definitely there. I just don't know if it's as intentional as it was in the old Jim Crow. So I think sometimes calling this the new Jim Crow, that phrase, it's really catchy and it makes sense to me in a way, but also it kind of maybe diminishes the old Jim Crow and how bad it was back then. And I don't know if there's the same kind of intentionality. Obviously there's discrimination, but the same kind of like, we're going to get together, because in the old Jim Crow, I mean, there were laws on the books where you couldn't do this because you were Black. And I don't know if it's not really the same now. It's more hidden, I suppose, hidden discrimination. We get a couple more minutes. Other comments? I'd love to hear them.
I think,
Okay,
go ahead. For me, the purpose of the book was to give readers the knowledge that you never thought of. I did things I never thought of, and I think it did that purpose for me, at least.
Good. I'm glad. Me too.
I'm just wondering how much of the disparity has to do with education and should I say life experience and the ability to either talk your way out of something or else find a good lawyer. So, I mean, I think that's part of the cause of the disparity.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I will share my screen one more time to just, I tried to do some research to see if there's anybody out there that has come out and disagreeing with some of the parts of the book. And there's another book that came out by a professor at Fordham called Locked In: The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform, where he basically was saying that what Michelle Alexander talks about is important, and we do need to get the drug issue fixed in the country and deal more with rehabilitation. We don't need to incarcerate these people for drugs. But he said that's not going to fix the mass incarceration problem, because more than half the people in state prisons, and that's where most people are held, they're not in federal prison, they're in state, more than half the people have been convicted of a violent crime. So he says that until the last part there is a quote from his book, until we accept that meaningful prison reform means changing how we punish violent crimes, true reform will not be possible. And so we have to not only look at the drugs issue, violent crime, and I'm going to switch to another slide here where a really good article on Vox, VOX, good website. I read some stuff on there. So you can go check this out. I would encourage it to kind of get two sides of it. They both agree that mass incarceration is a problem. It's just John Pfaff, I guess is how you'd say his name, thinks that fixing the drug problem alone is not going to fix the problem. This context is crucial to understanding why mass incarceration happened. It was a reaction to a massive violent crime wave from the 70s to 80s. Violent crime rose dramatically across the US. And so basically what I took away from this is it is very complicated. And it's going to take a lot of work to get this under control, and it needs to have a lot of work. And what I want to say and I'll take a couple more comments, but as a transition, honestly, you guys just being a part of this is and coming here and listening to this is part of that job. Like, we all have a part to play, and you guys are helping that. not because you're hearing this stuff, but also because the money that you have donated to the clinic or paid to go this eventually can work itself back to our expungement help desk, where we help all these people get jobs. And so, and that's part of it, right? That's part of it. So I do appreciate that. Does anybody, before I turn it over to Lena, does anybody have any final comments about the book? I hope you guys enjoyed the book. I mean, as much as you can enjoy it, but it's pretty depressing, right? I mean, it's not, so, and it's pretty heavy.
Yes, I just have a quick question, because on the book, she was saying how some people were like put in prison for life sentences just for like having, you know, cracks in their house or in the.
Yeah.
How much do you think that is true? Like, I mean, and do you think that what percentage of people that happen are blacks versus white?
Yeah.
I was just curious. I mean,
Good
does that
question.
happen to white people as well as black people?
Yeah, I have a good friend who's a prosecutor, and it seems to me that I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I've heard him talk about before. That's all right. That's all right. I'm glad you asked the question. But I don't know if Indiana has this, but some states will, or maybe it's a federal issue called a 3 strikes, essentially laws. Basically, you get caught with these felonies 3 times and these drug felonies, you can go to prison for life. And what it has done is taken some of the discretion away from the judges. So it's kind of, it's almost like automatic 3 strikes and you're out, and you can go to prison for life for just drug crimes alone, not just because you murdered somebody, but because of the drug issues. And statistics have shown that more that happens to African Americans more than whites. So
okay, so there is underlying.
yeah.
I mean, if that's the case, there is. I mean, I do believe there is underlying racial issue.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
For sure.
All right. Thank you.
One final thing I'll say is there's a really good book, and I think when Rachel was talking, it triggered in my mind. You have to Google it. I forget the title of the book, but if you just Google Terre Haute professor prison Shakespeare, you should look it up. Basically, it's a book where this professor, she was an English professor in Terre Haute, and she started to teach a Shakespeare class in the federal prison there in Terre Haute to predominantly African Americans that were on death row and just really violent, like lifetime offenders. And it's pretty amazing what she was able to do and how inspiring that was to teach them the Shakespeare, and they loved it, and it changed their lives, and it changed her lives. And so I listened to it on an audiobook, and I forget the title, but just Google that, and it's a really good book.
All right, thank you.
Any final comments? Well, thanks for listening to me and indulging my love for history. I appreciate that. And I know I'm not an expert on this. I'm like you guys. And so take what I've said with a grain of salt. It's just my opinion. But I hope you guys learned something. And we'll turn it over to Lena for the next part of the program.
How many times do we have to be on Zoom before we forget to unmute? Thank you, Matt. As Matt said, my name's Lena Hackett, and I work at a company called Community Solutions. And one of the things that we do is we are the backbone organization for the Marion County Reentry Coalition. So we've been working in the area of reentry here in Indianapolis since 2009. And so what I'm going to share my screen and there, you should be able to see it. Yes, good, thanks for the nods. So what I want to do is really take what you read about in the new Jim Crow and try to show what we see now, or what we see now in Indianapolis, and I really want this to be an interactive discussion. So if there is anything that comes up that you have a question about, just pop it right up, and I can make sure to send these slides to someone and they can get them out to you. So figure out how to advance my slide and we'll be good. That's not advancing, is it?
No.
Oh, there it went. So the Marion County Reentry Coalition is, it's an interesting coalition because it doesn't have any staff. So it's what we call a results-focused, data-driven model. So if anything's going to happen in the coalition, the people who are in the coalition have to make it happen. So they can't turn to me and say, we've had a really good idea, Lena, here, go ahead and do this, which really makes, what it happens then is that the people who are in the coalition are people who are really passionate about the work that they're doing. So everything that the Reentry Coalition does is focused on that targeted result statement that you see. All adults in Marion County involved in the justice system are successfully integrated into the community. And because of the disproportionate impact in the criminal justice system on people of color, the strategies that they implement are really focused on ensuring that they can have an impact on that population. This is, I know it's a lot of words and really small, but this, I like to show this slide because the Reentry Coalition members are everyone. I mean, so all of the criminal justice agency partners are members of the Reentry Coalition, nonprofit organizations, city county council members, policy members. We have Congressman Carson's office comes, we have some state agencies, Indiana University, Purdue University, Marion University, all of these people come regularly since 2009 and meet at least once a month to really talk about what needs to happen and to move those strategies forward. So it's quite a robust coalition in that way. But let's get right into who we're talking about. So when we're talking about what does it look like in Indianapolis every year, the Department of Corrections releases about 2,400 people to Marion County. And that is down, and I'll show you a chart in just a minute, that's down from about 5,000 people every year because there was a change in law. And as I said, I'll mention that. But then every day, 80 to 100 people are released from the Marion County Jail. So we have a lot of people returning to Indianapolis who then have a history of incarceration. This is the chart that I was talking about. You can see up here, 2009, Indianapolis is receiving about 5,300 people a year from the Department of Corrections. 2019, we're down to 2,400. Right here, where you start to see this decline, there was a piece of legislation passed that everybody calls House Bill 1006, and most people say it kind of grumbling. House Bill 1006 required that people who committed low-level felonies had to stay in their counties, had to stay in the jail. They couldn't go to the Department of Corrections. And people who were going to the Department of Corrections now had to serve 75% of their sentence before they could be considered for release. Prior to 1006, that was 50% of their sentence. So people who have committed low-level felonies are staying in their counties, and people who are going to the Department of Corrections are staying there longer than they would have normally stayed prior to 1006. What this has caused is, it now looks, if you just looked at the data, it looks like the Department of Corrections is really doing this super great job because look, they're releasing about half as many people. So they're having, so many fewer people go in. But once you know the story of the data, you understand that they've just transferred those people. Those people are staying locally. So it's still the same number. They're just not showing up on the Department of Correction roster.
Excuse me. Hi, Lena. I have a question. Is there a way to extrapolate what the latter years to the present could look like without that law changing? I mean, what kind of trend would you expect to see if that law wasn't passed?
There probably is. In fact, I'm sure there is. I don't have it here to show you because I don't think we've ever calculated it. But the jail actually keeps track of it because, as you can imagine, if they have a lot more people who now have to stay at the jail, they now have a much bigger issue with overcrowding than they had before. So they like to tell everyone why their jail is overcrowded. And so they keep a really good count of 1006. They usually have close to 150 to 200 people every day that are what they call 1006 people. So I don't know. That law is really the primary reason those numbers went down. So I would have expected them to stay about the same. I would have expected us to still be around 5,000.
Okay.
This chart that you see, the numbers are really tiny. So I tried to make the lines really bright. This is the big piece of data that the Reentry Coalition looks at all the time, because their assumption is that if systems are working well and support services are in place, then what you would see is that people would not return to incarceration and people would not get rearrested. So they track the 6-month and 12-month return to incarceration and the 6-month and 12-month rearrest. And here 2009 is where they started, and they were doing pretty well. And then they had this huge uptick right here, House Bill 1006. And this is where they really spiked up, lots of people returning to the Department of Corrections. When we looked at the story behind that data, what was happening is if you're on parole, and parole is attached to being in prison. So when you're released, you're usually on parole, community supervision. If you violated that parole, you broke curfew, you had a dirty urine drop, whatever that was, you would typically have gone back to the jail, stayed in your county and gone back to the jail for a week, teach you a lesson, and then you're back out. Because the jails are now crowded, these people all go back to the Department of Corrections. So, to spin out this story, I am on parole. I live in Indianapolis. I violated that parole in some way. So I'm going to go back to the Department of Corrections. I'm going to go through their processing system, which is about a 2-week period. I'm going to get placed in a prison facility somewhere in the state. No guarantee at all that it'll be anywhere near where I live. So I've now lost my job. I've probably broken some of my support network. I may have endangered my housing. So this law had a really huge ripple effect, and especially with this spike. We were able to show this data to the Department of Corrections. So one of the scary things to us was until the Reentry Coalition produced this data, the Department of Corrections hadn't been tracking it. But as you can see, now they're having a little bit of a trend down, because their strategy then was, well, let's find another place in Marion County that people can go. So they now go to a facility called Brendan Hall. So now you violate your probation, you go somewhere in Indianapolis, maybe for a week, and you're back out. The odds of you keeping your job, keeping your house are all much more secure than they were before. So now you see, so this orange line is 12-month return to Department of Correction. The yellow one is 6-month return. This light blue is 6-month rearrest, and the dark blue is 12-month rearrest. If you look at the end of this grid, it looks like we must be doing something really, really well, because look how much better we were doing than we were doing before. But this is COVID. This is last year when everybody was in a pandemic. So there were a lot of accommodations in the criminal justice system. Police officers were issuing citations rather than arresting people, trying to keep from congregate living in the jails or in the prisons. So this is really a falsity. And really the only reason it came down was because of those accommodations. What the Marion County Reentry Coalition is working to do with this is to show that whatever those accommodations were, we should keep them. Because clearly people were being arrested at a lower rate and people were returning to incarceration at a lower rate. So something was working. This is that same data by race. So we talked about disproportionate impact and we try to look at all of our data by race. It's not always collected that way, so sometimes it's more difficult. The blue line is rate of rearrest on a new charge. So that means that another offense was created instead of a technical rule violation, like they had a dirty urine drop, broke their curfew, something. So they actually committed a new offense. So this is the black rate. You can see oops, I didn't mean to do that. I don't know how to back up, but there we go. There's the black rate is the blue line. For whites, it's the gray line. And for Latinx, it is the orange line. If you just looked at this chart, you would think, well, there's not much of a disproportionate impact because blacks and whites are going back are being rearrested at the same rate. So this is that chart by 12 months. The first one was 6 months. This one's for 12 months after release. You see the same trend in the data. But this is what's important to know. So those are percentages. But if you look at the number of people who are in the Department of Corrections, you have 706 Black people, 437 white people. So when you're doing a percentage, that's an incredible disproportionate impact. Because just to make it simple for me for math, let's just say that that rate was 10%. That would mean that 70 people who are Black are going back and only 43 people who are white are going back. So there's your disproportionate impact. So when we look at it by percentage, it's not as striking as when you look at it by number. So this chart, because everything we do is really focused on data, we look at a lot of data because we try to figure out what are our strategies going to be. So what you looked at before was just plain old arrests. This, without getting into too much complicated detail, people are either arrested because they committed a new crime, or they're arrested because, again, they violated some condition, they have a warrant out, they did not commit a new crime, they broke a rule, and maybe a pretty serious rule, but it wasn't a new crime. So what is in orange here are all of the people, the percentage of people rearrested for that reason, because they broke a rule. The blue is people who committed a new crime. The important thing about this grid is look at the percentage of people who are being rearrested because they broke a rule. So they're going back to prison, they're going back to jail, not because they committed a new crime. The Marion County Reentry Coalition looks at this orange number quite a bit because we figure if you can implement strategies so that there are alternatives instead of going back, this rate of rearrest and rate of incarceration would go down tremendously. Sorry, I'm having way problems. There we go. So one of the things that we talk about and that they talk about in the new Jim Crow is how much it costs to be incarcerated. And when I talk about how much it costs to be incarcerated, how much it costs to break the law, this isn't what it costs us, the taxpayers. This is what it costs the people who are engaged in the court system. So there are fines and fees in Indianapolis, and some are set by the state and some are set by counties. And this is just a quick little list of fees that are in place set by state law. And all of these bullet points are just a whole list of the fees. And then you can find that there's a 39-page manual that lists all of the Indiana trial court fees depending on your level of crime and whether there was alcohol involved and whether there was a child involved. And these fees and fines can add up. It really lends towards what we call criminal debt. So people incur these fines, they incur these fees, and then they become incarcerated and don't have much of a chance to pay them back. What the research will tell you is these fines and fees either go unpaid or they're actually paid by the family of that person. And these are not all, they're not all the cost of the court or the cost of the public defender. You know, child abuse prevention fee. Again, there's no judgment on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but a child abuse prevention fee is to fund child abuse and child abuse prevention education. Again, that's not a bad thing, but what we find is we keep ticking away at this population in terms of fines and fees. For the juvenile system, it's a little more clear cut. They usually have a probation fee. A lot of times they'll have a restitution fee. So if a juvenile broke a window, stole a car, you know, they need to make restitution and they need to make that right. There'll be a public defender's fee, and then there are the court costs. And again, it's a juvenile. These aren't paid by the person who committed the crime. It'll be paid by their family. And then, you know, in the new Jim Crow, she talks about e-incarceration quite a bit, and we shorten that up to e-carceration. So if you're not going to go to prison and you're not going to go to jail, an alternative to that is to be on community supervision. And one part of community supervision is that you would wear an electronic monitor. You might have seen people who are wearing them. It almost looks like they have like a pager or a beeper or a small cell phone kind of strapped to their ankle. They're pretty They're pretty inconvenient, large devices that you have to keep charged. So if you're sentenced to community corrections, there's a $75 fee to hook that up, and the charge is $14 a day. So if you're sentenced to community corrections for 6 months, that's going to cost you $2,600. This is a population that is disproportionately poor, and this fee most often goes unpaid. If it goes unpaid, then you're turned over to the credit agency. So the ripple effect of what can happen just keeps going on. So now you have a bad credit history. Trying to pull yourself back to successful reentry just gets harder and harder. Very frequently, not only is there an electronic monitoring fee, but there's also an alcohol monitoring device on it. So you have to blow into a device every day, which almost doubles this per day fee. So this entire system of e-incarceration, electronic monitoring, it's paid for by the clients. It's not part of the county budget. It is, I think in Marion County, it's 23% supported by the county budget, which means a vast proportion of it is coming from the fines and fees, again, on the backs of people who are poor. I work in another county here in Indiana, and their county doesn't contribute to any of the cost. So it's all on the burden of the people who are sentenced. Now, if you get sentenced to jail, you don't pay a daily fee. If you get sentenced to electronic monitoring, you pay a daily fee.
What happens if they can't pay?
They accrue a debt. And it's an interesting, so you can, if they're indigent and can be declared indigent, then there's no fee, or there's a sliding fee scale. But they have to be declared indigent. And in order to be declared indigent, they have to do a financial analysis, which means, getting your utility bills, all of those things you have to pull together, if you're going to do if you're going to do your taxes or file for a financial aid form, you have to be able to turn all of those things in. It'll be evaluated, and then they might be able to do a sliding fee scale. But otherwise, it accrues when your sentence is up. If you still haven't paid it, then I said you get turned over to a collection agency.
Wow.
Now you have bad credit.
Yeah, and not only if you go to jail or prison, you don't have to pay anything. So a lot of these people will say, well, rather than incur all this debt, I'll just opt to stay in prison.
It can happen. It can happen that way. And also, it sounds, so I did some work with community corrections, and I thought, well, I'm going to put on one of these ankle monitors for 2 weeks because I need to see what this is like. I made it 3 days. It sounds, if you haven't done it, it sounds like, well, so you put on an electronic monitor, you get to walk around the community, you get to see your family. Clearly that's better than being incarcerated. And I would say it probably is, but there are things like victim zones. So if I had a victim, then there's a victim zone. I can't walk into that victim zone, but I don't know what it is. So I only know what it is when I walk into it. And then my buzzer buzzes and I have 5 minutes to get out of it. If it's on my way from home to work through a victim zone, I have to find another way to get to work because I can't go through the victim zone. Again, I don't know what it is. So because they want to tell you where the victim is, which makes complete sense. They often don't hold their charge. If you have a job like in an industrial setting with big steel girders, many times the signal doesn't get transmitted because of that. I mean, think of when you can't get a cell phone signal, and it'll cause all sorts of issues with perhaps even racking up some violations. It really is very, very difficult to be on electronic monitoring. Again, probably better than being locked up, but it's a job. It really is.
So are the families still eligible for food stamp if, let's say, a breadwinner of the family is on electronic monitor or like 6 months?
Yes, they are now. And it's been recent that if you have a felony conviction that you're eligible for food stamps.
Okay, I mean.
And they can be on HIP 2.0 Medicaid. As long as they're on electronic monitoring, they're fine for that. So yes, they can access public benefits. So, and then we talk about privatization. And I want to just point this out because a lot of what she talks about is how much it costs. What are the private costs? And what we hear about a lot, and Mayor Hackett with the Community Justice Campus, he pledged there'll be no private jails. Right now, there is a private jail in Marion County. There are 2 jails, Jail 1, Jail 2, very creative names. Jail 1 is owned and operated by the Marion County Sheriff's Office. Jail 2 is a private jail. So we pay a contractor to operate that private jail. They're guaranteed a certain amount of money every year, regardless of how many people they have. It's privatization and it's for-profit incarceration. So Mayor Hackett pledged that that's not going to happen on the Community Justice Campus. So when the new adult detention center opens at the end of the year, it's owned and operated by the Sheriff's Department, and there'll be no more private jail. However, GTL is the system of phone calls and emails and any communication you want to have with someone, a loved one who's incarcerated. It has a cost per minute. It has a pretty horrendous cost per minute to send an email to make a phone call. It's all privatization. The commissary is privatized. So if you put money in a commissary account for someone, that's a private vendor. So sandwiches, chocolate bars, donuts, whatever that is, are about double the cost. And the Department of Corrections, which is the prison system, still has 6 private facilities, I think. And one of them is called Heritage Hills. You're going to go and stay at Heritage Hills. Doesn't that sound pleasant? It is a prison. It's a maximum security prison that's privately owned. But, it's, and the purpose for it is that there's just not enough public money to fund them. So they privatize. But when there's a for-profit motive, then the whole situation can change in terms of ability to pay and retribution for not paying. It's a money-making deal. So the Reentry Coalition works on services, and we also work on policy stuff. And so I wanted to talk about just a couple of things that this legislative session we have addressed. House Bill 1376 was about bail reform. So the Reentry Coalition and most of the people across the country believe that when you are arrested and you go through the court system and they assign bail to you, that should be based on your risk to reoffend. How risky are you that you're going to commit another crime? So instead of being let out because you can pay your money bail, people think you should be let out because you're a low risk person. But right now, I could be a murderer and I could have a bail of $100,000. If I pay my $100,000, I'm out. I could be a person who public intoxication and I have a bail of $200. If I can't pay my $200, I'm going to sit there. So it's all about how much you can pay. So there's a lot of work going across the country on bail reform. House Bill 1376 was proposed in the state legislature and sponsored by a woman by a legislator who, this was brought to her by the American Bail Coalition. So these are people who are bail bondsmen. They do it for a living. And what they were saying is if you were a charitable organization and you wanted to bail somebody out, before you can do that, you have to be registered with the Department of Insurance. And you can only pay $2,000 or less. And in addition to you could be a church, you could be whatever, a not-for-profit, that person still has to have a bail agent. And you have to pay to have a bail agent. Unless they will let you do 2 people every 180 days. So Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic could bail out 2 people every 180 days, 4 people a year, and not have to meet these requirements. But if they wanted to bail out more than that, then they would have to do all of these other things. So it was a way for the bail industry to protect itself. And what they're worried about is the Bail Project. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Bail Project. It's a charitable bail organization. It's in various sites across the country, and we have one in Indianapolis. And they have a revolving bail pool. So they have a revolving pot of money, and they call them interrupters. They're basically case managers. They'll get a referral from the public defenders about there's an indigent person who's in jail. They're only in jail because they can't afford their bail. Would you go and talk with them? So the case manager goes and talks with them, does a risk assessment, sees how likely they are to if they paid their bail to stay out of jail, not to commit any more trouble, and they will bail them out. So you get your bail back if you show up in court. You lose your bail if you don't show up in court. So the golden ring is you want to make sure people are showing back up in court. So the Bail Project is a step towards bail reform. They are a charitable bail organization, so they will, you can see the average bail posted per client last year was just under $2,200. So they post that bail for you. They'll work with you, make sure you have transportation, whatever, housing, whatever your needs are to get you to your first court hearing. You get to that first court hearing, your bail gets paid back into their little loan pool, and then it's ready to bail me out when I need help. So that money just circulates itself as the money gets paid back. Bail bondsmen don't like that model because they don't make any money off of that model, but it works. There is a theory that if you pay money for bail, you're more likely to show up. So if my bail is $500 and I pay it, there's a theory that because that $500 is at risk, I'm going to show up. It doesn't prove out that way. It doesn't prove out that way at all. So what we know of these folks who didn't pay their bail, that the Bail Project paid it for them, 95% of them showed up for their court appearance, which is 1% higher than people who pay their bail. Of those clients who showed up, when they showed up for their hearing, their cases were dismissed. And if they weren't dismissed, they didn't have to spend any more time in jail. So say they were in jail for 10 days before the Bail Project got a hold of them. By the time they showed up in court, the judge said, your 10 days is good enough. You're done, you're released. So 87% of the time when these people showed up, they didn't have to spend another day in jail. And their demographics look a lot like what we see in the criminal justice system in terms of disproportionate impact. So you can see the majority of the people that they've bailed out, this red, for people of color, 32% white. Their age ranges, you know, pretty much of a bell curve like we would suspect, and primarily male. So this is who the Bail Project is serving. And they've posted bail for 566 people at the time this data was collected. So of those 566, if you figure, 87% is going to be hard for me. So let's just say it was 90%. So of that 566, only 56 of them spent another day in jail. And this is we always are trying to figure out what people need in order to be successful when they're released. What is the thing that's going to trip them up, that's going to send them back to prison, send them back to jail? Overwhelmingly, you can see housing is the hugest need. Being able to find stable housing for people who have a criminal history is the crisis right now. When the Marion County Reentry Coalition started this work, it was finding a job. We couldn't find jobs for anybody because of that criminal history. That is just not a problem at all anymore, but it's the housing. Because one of the things that landlords screen for is your criminal history. So one other piece of legislation and
I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted, on the slide that you just had, what changed from the big barrier being not getting a job to not having stable housing?
The economy.
Okay.
It's really what changed. It wasn't ban the box. People thought that, so ban the box is, if you've ever applied for a job, there's usually a box that says, have you ever committed a felony? So ban the box was, you couldn't ask that anymore on the application. So people really thought ban the box was the reason, until the research just showed that now instead of discriminating by that, we actually saw that employers were then just discriminating if you had all of the characteristics of someone. So if you were a Black male, 18 to 24, you actually had more discrimination than with ban the box, before ban the box. So ban the box was not the big answer. It was just the economy. People can't find employees.
Right.
And so, second chance employers became the phrase, and employers have started to make that risk. What is hard now is retention. Because
right.
if you've been incarcerated for 10 years and you come out and you get a job, knowing how to be on a job is difficult because you haven't done it.
Right. I definitely saw that in the manufacturing industry, where there was a trend toward a much more openness toward hiring people with records. So, and it was because they could not hire. They didn't have enough, there were not enough employees, so they were they backed into it kind of. They had to out of necessity rather than maybe, although I hope that their change in mindset might be happening as well. Thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that we did back into it. But again, your theory that, you know, what happens is if people are the loyalty in terms of the employees and the retention, if for a good employee that you're actually able to retain beyond 6 months, the data will show that retention continues. And when each experience is better and better, then yes, employers, you know, are now much more open to being, you know, what we politically correct call second chance employers than they ever have been in the past. And I think people who really blazoned that trail were labor unions. Labor unions were always a very friendly place for this population.
Thank you.
So this other piece of legislation is active still. So I guess the good news is we were able to kill that legislation about charitable bail and the bail project. So it never even got a hearing. It got assigned to the Financial Institutions Committee, and they were stunned by their own words at the input from people across the state in terms of letters and phone calls supporting a charitable bail organization. So because they're insurance people, they didn't know what this was going to do in terms of this kind of a response. So it's dead for this year. House Bill 1202, and Matt talked about this a little bit, and we talked about tough on crime, 3 strikes you're out. So what House Bill 1202 would do is if you are an inmate who had committed basically a drug offense, and I bullet pointed out which ones are specific, and you committed that offense before 2014, you have a much harsher sentence than if you committed that offense after 2014, because that's when sentencing reform happened. So House Bill 1202 is looking at what it wants to do is apply current sentence guidelines to people who were sentenced before 2014. So if I was dealing cocaine in 2013 and I got a 20-year sentence for it, and I'm dealing cocaine today, I would probably get a 7-year sentence for it. What they want is to be able to give the first person the benefit of the more lenient drug sentencing laws. It would affect about 1,400 people in the Department of Corrections who would qualify under this to have a sentence modification, basically based on being able to apply current day sentencing guidelines. This was up in the Senate for hearing on Tuesday. It passed 5-3, with the majority of Republicans voting for it. And there's nothing about that sentence that makes any sense to anyone, but that's what happened. It is highly supported by, as you can understand, the Public Defender Council, the Indiana Prosecuting Attorneys Council, not so much, because they feel like a contract was entered into and that contract shouldn't be broken. So it's now going to go for a second reading, and it has a chance. Probably still a slim chance, but it's never gotten this far before either. And so what would happen if this does get applied, and I qualify for this, I'd go in front of the parole board. So it's not an automatic. They're not just going to open the gate and we all walk out. If you go in front of the parole board, you still have to make your case that you were a good inmate, you deserve to be let out early, and then you can have your sentence modification. Okay, so fingers crossed, House Bill 1202, it's crossed over to the Senate, it's made it through one committee hearing, and hopefully it would be pretty revolutionary if it makes it through. And that's it. So that's, I know that was all kind of over the place, but when I looked through, I've read The New Jim Crow several times, and when I looked through it, I was trying to think of, I wanted to be able to share things that kind of were related to what you were reading in that book. Any questions, thoughts, reactions?
Lena, I recall that the bail project is relatively new in Indianapolis, maybe a year and a half, 2 years old. Is that about right?
Yes, it will be so it's a year and a half because they bailed their first people out, really schmaltzy, on Christmas Eve in 2019.
And so it's amazing to me that already they're getting enough traction that some organization was willing to try to get a legislature to support a bill to curtail their effort. It shows that they're getting traction to me. And you know, I heard about that project when it was first coming. I saw when they were first hiring, and it's just great to see that they're already making some progress with, I think you said 556 people have benefited from that.
And that's when that data was pulled. I peeked at something more recent that we had pulled together for testimony, and they're at 765 right now.
Oh, wow. So they are making headway. Who are their largest supporters? Like, are they church groups?
So they have so the Bail Project's a national organization that has local sites. So they have some national funders. The Cook brothers are huge funders, which is weird. But mostly, yes, they are faith-based organizations, community foundations like CICF here is a big supporter. They do pretty well on individual donations as well, but they do have a base of national funding that has gotten them started. You know, it was also assigned to, you know, us as a community that bail bondsmen are getting worried. I mean, that's a lucrative business, and it is. If they're feeling threatened by this, then that's a good thing. But there are also, I mean, there are judges that are against charitable bail, and the logic just doesn't make sense because, you know, if I'm going to arrest Susan and she's going to go through the court process and the judge is going to say, you have a bail of $1,000. What that judge is saying is, if someone pays $1,000, Susan can get out. So why does it matter who pays it?
Really?
It doesn't matter if a charitable bail organization pays it or if Susan pays it. But for some reason it does. And it's kind of that really old-fashioned conservative mind frame that people have to be accountable. They have to pay their own debts. You know, if they pay their own money, then that's going to really make them be compliant. And the research just doesn't play out on that.
But that's not really paying a debt, because if they show up in court, they get it back. So, I mean, it's like having the availability of the money in the right place.
It's an interesting, you know, it's always, you know, the rules of the game get changed when people finally figure out how to make the rules work for them. So the rules of the game about bail changed. And all of a sudden, you know, it matters who pays it. I have a friend who's a priest, and he, much to my dismay, spends lots of his money bailing people out of jail. And he would not be able to do that because he probably bails 4 people out a month. And as a priest, he wouldn't be able to do that anymore.
How about family? Can families pay for the bail?
Yeah. As long as it's not a charitable bail organization, that was their issue with it.
So family, friends, doesn't matter.
Yeah. I could go to the clerk's office and pay bail for 20 people I don't even know.
Oh, wow. I see. How does neighborhood legal clinic, how do you determine who to pay for bail for?
So this is through an organization called the Bail Project. Actually, you know, what would make people happy is if I could say they take in this risk assessment tool and they conduct it, and it's very rigorous. And so they have, you know, lots of data that shows if people answer these certain questions that they're a good risk to bail out. And it's really much more subjective than that. So I would go and I would interview this person and find out, do they have a place to live? Do they have a person, a grandma, a mom, a husband that cares about them? Do they have kids at home? What's their history been like? Have they showed up in the past? You know, if they have another crime. So it really is trying to figure out how fragile the person is in terms of what would make them come back to court and what would make them not.
Wow. That's really great work, I think.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool gig. One of the things that I think the Reentry Coalition is really proud of is the Bail Project. We contacted the Bail Project in September of 2019, and by December, they had staff and were bailing out their first person.
Wow.
And they said it usually takes them 2 years to get into a community, 18 months to 24 months. And because the Marion County Reentry Coalition, the sheriff is sitting there, the public defender is sitting there, they're all sitting at that table. So the Bail Project didn't have to go meet with 20 people. They just came to an MCRC meeting. You know, the sheriff loves the Bail Project. He wants those people out of his jail because they need money. You know, they offered to do a fundraiser. You know, it's like, just get them out.
So what percentage of them actually go back to work? I mean, how easy is it for them to get a job?
So it's far easier than it used to be. And a lot of the service providers will just, they talk about how it's not about getting the job anymore. You know, that is not there. I just connected one of the service organizations to an employer who's going to have jobs at $23 an hour, and they can't find it. And what really helps, if I can connect that service organization to that employer, then the employer knows if they've hired Lena and all of a sudden Lena's not quite working out, they can call the service organization and they will come and talk to Lena. So there's a social support network for the employer so that the employer can be just what he is, an employer and not a social service provider. That is one of the tools that really helps to recruit employers. Now, also a difficulty is transportation to the jobs. So if the jobs are out in the field, we've got a project in Tipton right now that one of the service providers actually buses. They have a van. They take 10 people up every day and bring them back. Transportation to Tipton. That is a big deal, is transportation or getting the jobs where it's on the bus line and people can get to them.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Lena, I'm curious about what are the typical types of jobs that folks that are reentering, you know, are able to get. And the second part of that question is, what kind of support do they receive if they want to be promoted or pursue education, further themselves along? Because I would like to think that once they get that landing and that good paying job, that they want to continue to improve and they may see opportunities, being able to surround themselves with the right people.
Right. So industries that are pretty friendly to this population, hospitality industry, so hotels, restaurants, that's a very friendly industry. Construction trades, warehousing, those are very friendly industries. Things have opened up though, so that it used to be if you had a criminal history, you were never going to work in healthcare. And that's just not the case anymore. I mean, there are certain positions you're never going to work in, but you can get into the industry. It's actually harder to become a cosmetologist because you can't get licensed. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean,
and yet there are cosmetology training programs at the Department of Corrections. So, sometimes it's hard to get positions that require you to drive because you may have lost your driver's license through all of whatever's going on with you. Because here's another thing. If you don't get your child support modification completed before you go to the Department of Corrections, say I owe child support and now I'm going to go to prison for 5 years, that's going to accrue at the rate that it would have when I was employed. So when I exit incarceration, I owe a whole lot of child support. Now you can do a child support modification, but it's not automatic. So you have to, and it's all paper right now. So you actually have to petition by paper the court that assigned your child. I mean, it's a process that can be done. And there are people out there that help people do that. But that's another the way that it is hard. It is hard to reenter. And I am not saying that to excuse anyone who committed a crime or, needs to walk through that system, but it's hard. So you get this job and now you want to get enrolled in school, and everything is difficult to do. And most likely your family's not that fond of you anymore. You probably burned a whole bunch of bridges. So having that kind of support network that the rest of us have, that's just not, that can't be a guarantee.
Yeah. I watched Netflix has a documentary about clothes. I know it sounds trivial, but they had this one story where there was a support group that supports mostly males that just come in back into the community, and they take them for their first meal out of jail. They take them shopping, and the point of the segment was, that kind of saying clothes that makes the man. People that will judge you, they recognize that you just came out of jail, that they would treat you differently, even though and also psychologically, the person will feel better, more confident about themselves when they, the guy that took him, this person shopping, he got like a nice plaid top and some khakis, and he felt like a human, So just.
I mean, think about if you'd been incarcerated 10 years ago and you came out today and somebody handed you an iPhone. I mean,
Oh yeah.
And that's how the world works.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like such a simple thing, but you have to be able to, you're going to apply for a job, it's going to be online. You're going to get benefits, it's going to be online. I mean, it's a lot. It is a lot. Again, no excusing people if they break laws or any of that, but just this thought that people can pull themselves up on the bootstraps and they should just be grateful to be out and work hard. It's a lot.
I mean, it just sounds like every little thing is like a reminder. And perhaps with all of these hoops, I mean, do you ever come across somebody that just, that they give up, that, that just, that just can't go on, it's just one thing after another.
I mean, sometimes it's just easier to go back to the life you were in because you knew how to do that.
Yeah.
Is there like suicidal rates too?
I don't know. I don't know anything about those, so I don't know.
Okay, sorry, asking.
No, that's absolutely fine. It's a great question. I just don't know. I mean, you could there's a high substance abuse use, so you could imagine that suicide isn't far behind.
Well, Lena and Matt, thank you so much for leading such a great conversation tonight. I think everyone found this very beneficial and eye-opening. And the conversation does not have to stop here. You are all welcome to continue engaging with the clinic. You can comment on our social media. It would be great to have a whole conversation going on our follow-up event post or something so that the discussion can continue. And Lena and Matt have both graciously offered to share their PowerPoints with us, so I'll send those out. Lena, you can go ahead and email that to me after this, and Matt, I think you did already. I'll send those out in my follow-up email, but I just want to thank all of you for coming to this event, and for those of you that have been to different parts of our 4-part Power Disparities series. It's been really, I think, a good season of growth for all of us to be able to engage in these conversations, and definitely a blessing to be able to, just continue the community conversation with all of you. So thank you so much for your support. Thank you for getting engaged with the clinic. There are ways that you can keep up with us if you are interested in hearing about future events or just kind of different stories of our mission and work. We have an e-newsletter that is no obligation. You can just go ahead and visit. I'll send the link in the chat here once I get my chat back open, but we have an e-newsletter where we'll send you updates. It's just a monthly email you'll get with different updates from the clinic, different future event announcements. We don't actually have anything except for a CLE for attorneys, a continuing legal education course coming up at the end of April. But other than that, that's the only event you can currently sign up for. But stay tuned. In the next few weeks, we should be posting more. So you can visit that at nclegalclinic.org is our website, /events is our events page. And as we talked about tonight, criminal record expungement is one of the ways to aid in the reentry process, and it takes the clinic about $50 for the staff time to help one person prepare the paperwork to get their criminal record expunged. And so if you'd like to make a gift toward the clinic to support our work in general, the free legal services we provide, and the increased access to justice for our low-income neighbors, I'm sending the link to donate to the clinic in the chat as well, but no pressure. And like I said, I'll send out the PowerPoint. I'm going to send out a post-event survey. Yes, one more survey I'm asking you to please fill out if you don't mind, just to help us gauge the impact of this Power Disparities series. It should just take a couple of minutes. And feel free to reach back out to me, respond to my email if you have any other questions for us or are interested in getting involved as a volunteer. I'm happy to talk to you about that and continue the conversation. But thank you all again for coming tonight. If anyone has any other questions for our speakers, we can probably stay on for another minute or two, but I'll go ahead and pause the recording and just kind of open it back up if anyone has any last minute thoughts.